Welcome to the Menu Combat podcast for JRPG fans who fiddle around in all their menus to customize their characters just the way they want. I'm your host, TheWolvesDen. Welcome to the very inaugural episode for what is essentially a seasonal JRPG podcast. Every summer, I'll spend about 8 to 10 weeks playing games because I'll have some free time and kind of explore some JRPG conversations that I've been having in my own head this entire time. I'm so glad that you guys decided to tune in. There are 3 parts of the show. A part about grinding. What have I been grinding on? What have I been focusing on? 2, what have I been reflecting on? What have I been examining over and over again? And then lastly, what are the bards giving us? What are the Hall of Fame songs? The songs that we should be paying attention to? That's kind of how this breaks down. So let's get to what I've been grinding on. I've been grinding on FF5. I finally finished Final Fantasy V. I started probably about 3 months ago. Whenever the Pixel Remaster dropped, I started then. I finished it this week, and I'm just blown away. See, I was excited to play FF5 because a lot of my favorite games of all time owe so much to it. And that also kind of made me place it on a pedestal going in. So I'm talking about, I was excited to play it because I love Bravely Default. It's in my top 10 favorite games. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is in my top 10 favorite games. And so knowing that, especially how I think about the job system has so much to do with what Final Fantasy V was innovating on, I was excited to finally play when the Pixel Remasters came to Switch. And I'm impressed. I think my brain wants to go in so many different ways, but what I want to highlight is just the tone difference. See, I've only played about 3 Final Fantasy games up until this point. I've finished 10, 9, and Original 3. And I know you could say 3 brought the job system, but there's no customization aspect to it the way that it really works when it comes to 5. So this is why I think 5 gets that badge of honor. But moving on beyond that, the thing that really blew me away was just how silly it was. And that's a good thing. This game is goofy. At first I was like, oh, maybe this is Dragon Quest-y, but Dragon Quest is whimsical. This was just goofy. I'm talking about, there's a moment in Final Fantasy V where you're going up this mountain, you avoid poisonous flowers, and then for the dramatic fight, your main character, Lena, falls off, and then she catches herself back on the corner, and then because part of the cliff collapsed, she throws a rope back, and they're just tie the rope together right in front of the boss, and then they climb the thing across, and it's done to an entire silly effect, and that's a build up to a boss battle, showing that this game doesn't take itself very seriously. It's very odd, but when FF5 leans into it, it can be great. I'm thinking specifically the villain Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is part of the secondary villain of the game. Shows up there are 3 worlds in the game. Shows up in the second world, and he's just saying some of the most ridiculous, silly dialogue bits, and he's complaining about losing, and you face him multiple times. To get a sense of how silly Gilgamesh is, when you officially beat him, and I'll use it in quotations because you fight him so many times, you get his treasure, and his treasure is called the Excalibur. Not Excalibur, Excalibur. And so when you look at the stats of it, it says 100 attack, which at that moment in the game is like, oh, this is one of the best weapons in the game. But it only hits for 1 each time. It only gets 100 attack if you throw it. It's that level of, I'm going to be ridiculous consistently, and you should not get too invested in the dramatic effects. And the funny thing is that while I do think it doesn't do a good job for the main character, Bart's, the tone does allow for when they do lead into dramatic things for other characters, specifically thinking about Krill and Galuf. Those things feel emotionally heavy and weighty, because it sits in stark contrast. I think that's one of the things about if a good game is able to balance a goofy tone with something serious, those serious moments provide a regrounding to those characters, so you can feel more emotionally effective because you've been kind of loose with them before. Sometimes it can undermine a character. As I said, I think it undermines Bart's, but it doesn't do that for other characters. Other characters get accentuated and feel more fleshed out. It's a really fascinating game from a goofy story standpoint. I mean, there's a whole point where you find in another world another library that has hidden books and so forth, and there's this little scene where, in order to progress, you have to put back the books in order where they're going on. And if you go to one of those shelves before you start putting away the books in order, Bart goes to a place that has A, and he's looking up. He's like, you hear in the dialogue, oh, he's looking up asses, and he's referring. The thing is that it ends up being about donkeys, but I think it's Gallup makes a mention as like, Bart, get over yourself, or let go of it. And so it is consistently riffing on itself, and I enjoy that. But that's not the reason why I came here, right? I had kind of gone in knowing that the story wasn't going to be sensational, and while I have suggested that there's some really grounded, beautiful elements of the story, that's not why I'm here. Also, I do want to make a quick aside. If you enjoy stories about animals and building relationships with animals, this game really does a good job of that. I mean, I would say if you enjoy the bonding of Pokemon, or even a little bit in DQ5, what they do with Saber, you'll appreciate how they treat specifically the dragons and the relationships with the dragons, or even with the Moogles, how they develop that, specifically through Krill. So if that is kind of like a passion thing for you, I think you actually enjoy parts of the story because they treat those with some real sincerity. But the reason why I'm here is because of the job mechanics. And I just gotta say, it's still so good. Like, it's just one of those things where you're like, okay, other games might have lapped this or taken more from this, but there's a flourishing moment when I was playing this game where I was like, oh, the OG still got it. It's one of those things where it's like, you know, when you're watching highlights of like Jerry West, and you're like, oh, that guy could play now. Like, you know it. And so when I say that with FF5, part of the limiting thing is that you get 4 different, jobs at each crystal. I mean, if you play Bravely Default, you know what you're kind of getting yourself into, except there's no job asterisks. But it's limiting in the sense that you can only carry, when you switch jobs, one ability over. You can only, if you're collecting stuff from Blue Mage, you can only carry over the learning ability or use Blue's magic. You can't do both. You can't, you don't have a lot of things that you can bring to the table to different jobs. And so it felt very much at first, I was like, oh, well, this is kind of limiting. And I feel like this game doesn't always do a great job with some of its bosses to feel like, oh, if I went this route, I could still beat this boss. And if I did this route, sometimes it does feel like there's a best optimal strategy. And not in a way to teach you about certain jobs, but just like, it's the best optimal strategy. And so sometimes I was a little let down, but I think that's a little bit on my end, particularly because I didn't use all 21 jobs. I mean, technically 22, but I didn't think about the Mimic. And so you could argue and say, yo, WolvesDen, you didn't really use the Geomancer, or you didn't really use, what is another one I didn't use? The Dancer. So you didn't get the most out of the juice of the system. But I would say that it's like, what could you really, what synergies and combos can you get when you only have one thing that can port over? And so I kind of fell into default strategies, or default of like, well, this has been comfy and I'm going to stick with this. And I do conceive that certain bosses are designed for you to be like, all right, let me change my strategy. And their bosses were difficult some of the time. And so I don't want to take that away from it. But it felt like if I'd been building certain jobs with certain characters and creating certain synergies, I don't think I could always use a lot of those different synergies to solve the boss. It felt like, well, you just need to fix it in this way. But I did try jobs that I normally wouldn't do. I was invested in the Blue Mage. That's the first time I've always wanted to do a Blue Mage, but it's always so much of a hassle to catch the enemy, then have it do moves on you. And so I think one of the biggest compliments I want to highlight with Final Fantasy V is that, there's a plethora of moves you can learn. I would even say more than what Kina can learn in FF9. It feels like there's so much more options. And Blue Magic is really powerful, versatile, and it feels like you remember certain boss battles because I got it from that. So all of those things made the Blue Mage slash Beastmaster a synergy of using control here, having learn ability, like synergies like that made the Mage worth learning. And it's one of the first times I really put that effort in compared to something like when I did it in Tactics Advance, I didn't really do it. Or I even mentioned with Kina. Kina was a left behind character. And so I say that to really get at that FF5 is just wonderful. And I think what really took me to the point with these jobs, I'm like, okay, this game is really got a trick up its sleeve that even other games don't, is how they use the freelancer class, right? So for typical games like this, you get a freelancer class at the beginning, you switch over, and you can switch back. But this is the first time where, and maybe I'm tripping because I don't remember it in either Bravely Default or Bravely Second. And those are my frames of reference. I mean, I know Octopath has its own thing going on, or even Triangle Strategy. But those are, well, I mean, I've played Triangle Strategy, but those are different. What I'm getting at is that you don't just get the ability benefits of carrying abilities over to the freelancer and then have all the weapons available. Is that if you master a class, you get the stat boosts. So it makes one of those things where it's like if you invested in a class and you finish it out, you get to take all the benefits over to the freelancer. So you don't just, a freelancer can equip multiple abilities of different classes and have the stat boosts and use whatever items. And it became one of those things where at the end, when I was stuck in the final dungeon, it was very dizzying, the amount of options that I had. It was very much of a case of, oh my gosh, everything I knew about this system just blows wide open. And I can now see that for people who do multiple playthroughs, that you just are walking out with such different character builds every time. Because you're not going to master all the classes at the time. And even thinking about me, I used the EXP, not the EXP boost. I don't think I really used that. I used the job ability boost. And so I'm thinking I went out of my way to try to get certain things mastered just to complete. But I'm even thinking if you don't and you take it more leisurely and just the feeling of like, oh, I can carry this over and that feels of rewarding. This was truly engaging to see that how the freelancer class was able to like take advantage of what you invested in. And so you really got to see the evolution of builds that were wholly unique to what you emphasized on your journey. It's truly sensational. So I think when we talk about it from a story standpoint, I was able to appreciate some of the moments, even appreciating the goofy moments, goofy components. We talked about a little bit with the actual core mechanics. I think the only thing that's really holding this game back is that everything else is just kind of whatever. Locations don't really matter to me. And I think this is one of the things I hold against particularly older games. It's that in order to really stand out, you want the mechanical thing or you want a story thing, but I also think I want locations. It's the reason why I've critiqued Earthbound a lot when I was playing. If you search my timeline, I've said some slanderous things about that game. But the more and more I think about it, the more and more I remember so many idiosyncratic moments. I think that's just how the game is designed to be in that way, and so it's like a slice of life consistent. But I'm talking about the locations, Forside, Threed, all of those places, the mall in Tucson, like those become memorable locations. And I'm thinking about for FF5, am I going to remember any of the locations? And I don't think so. And I think like the dungeons are pretty solidly designed. They aren't amazing, but they aren't bad. And I think it was a good sign that these are really well designed dungeons, that they didn't feel like there's an optimal way to navigate them. And so I got lost. I got frustrated. I got that. But what outside of maybe the dungeon in the pyramid, because of all the snakes and how out of the way you have to maneuver through that, I don't know if I'm going to remember anything else. I will say the highlight, like, and this is a spoiler-ish. I've been trying to be light on spoilers, right? Notice that. So I didn't even give you any story spoilers for real. But I would say the thing when I'm like, oh, this game had a trick up its sleeve, I wish it had more of it, is specifically talking about Phantom Village. Phantom Village is incredible. It's one of those things where it's like the town doesn't feeds both back into the lore. So part of it is, again, very light spoilers, that there are multiple worlds in play. And so what they talk about with Phantom Village is found in between the cruxes of the old and new world, so to speak. And what they're, or World 1 and World 2, not old and new. And what they get at specifically is the fact that on the world map, it will not tell you where it is. You bump into it and it becomes like an illusion. You get some of your best weapons, magic, and so forth. But what's cool about that is that in order to get to the good shops in those towns, you go to the regular shops, and then you kind of have to solve an environmental puzzle to figure out, how do I get to certain places? So you have to really pay attention to layouts. You have to walk in and out of buildings, go around, find secret entrances. It's wonderful. It really builds the idea of this town being mystical and being lost in this time because you just bump across it. Because that's what happened to me. I had seen it in a walkthrough that there's a place that called Phantom Village, and it was like, oh, whatever. And then I was just exploring on the world map, and I bump into it. I'm like, so you weren't even really gonna tell me? Like, if I didn't see it mentioned in the walkthrough, I would have never heard of it. And so I think even the way that I engaged in it and just randomly popped up upon it, it would have even felt even deeper. But what's wonderful is that it gets reused in the major story crux moment. And you revisit that town and it's frozen in time to really highlight that it's really this in-between space between where the dungeon, where one world ends and where one world begins. It's just truly mystical, and it's extremely impeccable design. It's one of my favorite things in that game. It's one of those things that highlight that you can do real solid environmental storytelling that reinforces the lore of the game to communicate an idea, even in a game that's not traditionally plot heavy. So I wanted to give real strong props to that. And so those are some of my thoughts on Final Fantasy V. I feel like I could continue going. You can tell I'm gushing over it. But I think you guys get the impression that for a game that is the ancestor to a lot of my favorite games, this is a game that I am truly enamored by. It's not a perfect game. It's not any of that. I would have loved to be able to say, yeah, this is better than Final Fantasy IX. I can't say that. I'd be lying to you. But it is a truly remarkable game, and I'm glad I made this as my primary focus, because I've not played 4, 5, and 6 of the Final Fantasies. I mentioned I've only played a few, and so this is my SNES introduction, so to speak. So let's talk about what are we reflecting on? What am I ruminating on? I've been thinking about sidelined protagonists. And what do I mean by sidelined protagonists? I'm talking about protagonists who are not the main drivers of a story. And at first I was going to just talk about a silent protagonist, but I think this is bigger than silent protagonists. This is a protagonist who's on an accessory to the larger thing. And it could be silent, but doesn't necessarily need to be. And a lot of people tend to critique these kind of characters. They say that this is antithetical to good storytelling, or I can't get engaged in the game because of this, or things of that nature. And I feel that you're losing a couple of things. One, and I think it's more important in the medium of video games than any other medium, is that you do need someone who can ground you in that world. So that is one of the major techniques that exists, which is that you have a character who doesn't talk, they are a fish out of water, end up in a new world, and so they exist as a player surrogate to that place. And I don't think that's inherently bad. And you can think about it done in multiple ways. Let's take something, for example, like Fire Emblem. Back in the GBA games, you were the tactician. And so you had no player character there, but Erica would talk to you on the screen, they'd give you the compliments, they'd do that. And then I think Fire Emblem tried to personify and give a player avatar character to really bring that point forward. I know that that's a very contentious decision because people have critiques of Robin as a character, or even the critiques you can get at as Corrin, but Corrin I think situates a little bit differently because of how the story of Fire Emblem Fates plays out. But let's using Robin, I think that's an example of a character that talks a little bit, has some story bits, but let's keep it a book. He's there to be an accessory or a sideline to watch what's happening with Crom and Lucina. So that's a good example. Another example is the character from Xenoblade Chronicles X. You create a character, come out of a pod, and you're there for Elma's story. Like let's keep it jiggy. That's what you're there for. And I haven't finished X. I don't know how it fully rounds out. But you're thinking about like what is a sideline protagonist. Same thing. If you want to go in DQ, that's the DQ11 main protagonist 11. Like he don't even really have a name. They just call it hero. It's there for a larger thing. And they do a good job of grounding you, right? Like they talk to you in a way, and I get it. It's a little bit like, oh man, can't you trust me to figure this out? But it's always, I think for a 40-hour RPG, it's a little bit harder for those worlds to be conveyed in a way in which you don't do a fish out of water. And you can argue that maybe you don't even need for the character to be neutral, or I'll use the word bland, but I'm using it very lightly here. And you can say, hey, what about what happens over with Tidus going into the world, is it Spira? And how they do that, and they do a fish out of water, but you still have a person with essentially a own agency and so forth. And I think that's effective, but I don't think that's the only way to do it. Because I think you can be firsthand watching people evolve, and I think that can be equally as satisfying and gratifying as you being the one to do it. I don't think one is inherently better than the other, especially in the medium of games. I think one of the things that we do in this space is that we want these stories to play out traditionally the way that we think of stories in other mediums. And that doesn't need to happen. One of the things that it can do is that it can add to the lore of a game. I mentioned that before, that with Xenoblade Chronicles X, the way that they introduce Mira, it's the idea that the entire population has been preserved in capsules, falling on this colonized planet. And so therefore, you going through that experience sets up the larger stage and aspect of what it means to be a citizen of Mira, and what it was like for people to engage in that experience of familiarization of that world. I think that works. I think that feels like it does a lot of world building, and it does well for what one of the first twists of the game only can work because of how they treated the main character. So I think there's a potential storytelling value in having this. I think it can also fail lore-wise if you don't really take advantage of it in the story. So I mentioned one place where I think they make good use. A place that they don't make good use, I'm thinking of Ni no Kuni 2. Now, mind you, I have a lot of qualms in this game. But I think about when I first played that game, you had the most imaginative conceit. You have Roland, who's either the president of the United States or the president of the world. It's something crazy like that. Gets essentially isekai'd into the world of, I forget the little boy's name, but essentially he gets isekai'd into the world with the little boy, main character. And so you are the player character being centered around Roland, but Roland is helping the main character who's dealing with the fact that there is an entire betrayal of the Mouse Kingdom by, I forgot the name of the other animals. And essentially, the game is about the main character creating a new kingdom. And so the game is about creating a new kingdom because it's about the betrayals and trying to step up to the throne, things of that nature. So you can see conceptually, if I'm the developer, why do I create a character like Roland? You're not only creating a character like Roland to like isekai into that space, but you're also creating a character like Roland to be a additional politician to help the main character learn about politics and navigating people. And they do that a little bit, but I don't think you get into some interesting elements of either thinking about politics from our world as being different than their world. You don't really get into that. And I think when you get into the side quest format or the way that the story is told, it's very much do this thing for me and I'll be your friend. And so like Roland is there. So you're there watching this happen. But I don't think you get to get any of the benefit of Roland being a fish out of water character. I don't think it adds to the world in any way from a lore perspective. And maybe I'll feel different when I finally beat the game. Maybe there is some like larger thing about how Roland fell in and how that felt and that ties to. But the world ain't got it, man. Like, that world is really boring, and politically it's not pretty interesting. And the way that they're conveying what it means to recruit citizens, like, none of it gets accentuated by who Roland is. Roland's role as an outside character doesn't benefit. You see, at least when you go on to, because you could throw that back at me and say, but what about Robin? Robin don't got nothing to do with the story. Or even thinking about what's another good, even 11, right, from Dragon Quest 11. You'd be like, well, what do they really add to the story? At least if you're doing a traditional save the world joint. What ends up happening is that your supporting cast are intersecting with the main story. And so they take, I don't want to say they hijack it, but the side characters become so meaningfully effective, and their stories are about how you're changing the world and they're changing as you're changing the world. I don't get that from this. Roland isn't a piece that helps other people change. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at. Roland isn't helping other people change. None of the characters are changing. There's nothing that you get benefit from the background of the character, and you're not getting the fact that he's the main character changing the world, and therefore people are changing around him. Like, you don't get any of it. And so Roland isn't a really compelling character, and you don't get any of the benefits. I don't think you get anything interesting. And so when you talk about critiques of Sidelined Protagonists, that would be one of the weaker ones. But one of the things I think people think about when they talk about Sidelined Protagonists or characters who are not that deep, it's that they want more direct empathy. And I'm confused about that for people who've been playing games as long as I have. What do I mean? I'll use a non-RPG to kind of prove my point, but it goes all the time. People have said in the Breath of the Wild reviews, well, I can't connect with the main character Link because Link doesn't have an explicit personality, or that they're filling in the blanks of what Link is saying, and so therefore I can't really get invested. And I don't get it. What happened to the ability to be imaginative in our and see what they're gesturing at as the suggested empathetic emotion? And that's not to say that you can't have characters do well in the other way around, right? Where, like, oh, they're a main character, they have their act and agency, but that's a very different tone. Often, I would say even a little bit abrasive tone sometimes, versus a character like Link or a character like the hero from Dragon Quest, where they're a part of the journey. You want to know, I even argue that Bart's is kind of like that. Bart's has some story, historical importance, but it's not his story. You can argue that all you want, but that really is Galuf and Krill's story more than anybody else. You can argue that Lena and Faris have it more than Bart's. But either way, my point being that I don't need Bart's to say anything because I'm feeling what's happening on the screen with the other characters. I don't need Bart's to say anything when we go back and see Faris engage with the ghost of Sylvan. I don't need Bart's to say anything. I'm feeling the feelings. And I can see it on Faris's face, right? So that's the other thing. It's not as if the side characters are not emoting or expressing. I don't need Bart's to emote and speak for me. I can feel. I can see what the game is conveying. And I think there's a level of imaginativeness of seeing what the game is conveying and filling in the blanks. And that's a part of the gaming contract. Like, why does that need to be always expressed to the T? I'm thinking very much so, what's another good example that I really want to tackle in? That, do I need someone else to tell me what I'm feeling? Dang, I can't think right now. But do you need Link to tell you what Impa has felt, or do you need Link to respond to what Impa's felt? Aren't you just feeling what Impa's felt? Or when you meet Cass, or when you meet anybody in that Zelda universe, what use does Link's emoting really do? Because it's about you feeling it, and you can get conveyed the feeling without the reaction. I feel that there is this desire to place the character in opposition to what's happening in the world, and that makes it more meaningful. And maybe that's as a result of the characters I can think of that I think have more agency in their worlds, and that they're not just along for the ride. They tend to be more dour, right? I'm thinking, this is an example. I'm thinking Jesse Faden as a character who has a lot of agency in that world. And you can sense the hesitancy and so forth, and that works. I like Jesse as a character, right? But I don't think I need that in an RPG per se, right? I'm thinking even about how they try to give characters voices in Mass Effect, and how even in the more nicer versions of what a character is doing, it places you in conflict with the world rather than in empathy with the world. And I think that's part of what I'm thinking, is that I think neutral characters allow you to be empathetic to what's happening in the world without them responding in that way. You can insert into that feeling, and you can insert into the empathy that is being gestured at. And that's not to say that that the others don't work, but why are we now throwing that out as a form of game storytelling? Because that's always what it's been. I think about this, right? When you play something like Chrono Trigger, no one in the history of the universe is like, well, man, you know what, Chrono would be better? Be better if he was a talking character. Nobody says that. Nobody has that in their hearts as a critique of Chrono Trigger, because the cast is so strong. That's another thing I want to highlight, is that if a cast is strong, you can get around a main character. I think it's such a fundamental component to all of this. But beyond that, there are certain things that Chrono does to emote that are abstract representations of a feeling that if you were to just translate it into more graphical fidelity, wouldn't work. When he does his whole fist pumping thing, or he's doing certain laughing, like if you were to just literally throw that into a 4K representation of a modern Akira Toriyama drawing of Chrono, it wouldn't work. You would lose the abstractness, and I think that abstractness is a part of the gaming experience. It is a part of the being immersed in that world, is the amount of your thinking about that world and applying your perspective onto that world. And so you can get, like, how would you translate the robo scenes? I'm talking about the robo dancing. Like, how does that get conveyed in a 3-dimensional space for you to feel it? Like, I'm thinking so much about certain sprite expressions where they're just jumping and the eyes are bulging. It is an abstract communication of a thing that doesn't have to tell you, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling this. Like, the sprite animation does the work. And it does the work because it is essentially approximating a feeling, and you can feel that in. Why don't we appreciate that? And why is that all of a sudden looked at as like this mediocre way of telling a story? I think I'd honestly say that as we got into more 3-dimensional designs, that the ability to approximate a feeling or gesture at a feeling without you having to have it defined explicitly by the main character is a classic art form of gameplay that we've all of a sudden said, well, we don't need that anymore to fall in line with other styles of storytelling. And it's not one or the other. This is not this is better than that. It's that this is a form that our medium had in one way to convey a feeling, and then there's an experience from the player that is actually meaningful. That it doesn't need all the accoutrements, that just literally moving a character back and forth in certain frames does so much for expressing personality that doesn't need to be said to you explicitly through dialogue. Like, and maybe that's just a part of the thing that I'm getting at here. It's that animation, in terms of, can express something about a character, and you don't need the dramatic theatrics of a main character to do it if you can just watch the other people say certain things or watch certain people just move. I don't know. It's been one of those things where it's like, I think about these Sidelined characters, the critiques that JRPGs get, or Zelda gets, or Dragon Quest gets, for not just giving you a main character, or Fire Emblem gets sometimes, where there's like, well, you're trying to have your cake and eat it too, where you get certain storytelling affordances that allow you to just be invested in a way that's not just about the specifics, but about the larger world. But maybe you disagree with me. But what are some of your favorite Sidelined characters? How have they been used? Do you like any silent characters? I think, as I said, it can work. I don't think I need all of my characters to speak. I think that's just a challenging barrier. I'll end with this before I get into what is the Bard's playing. I watched the Super Mario movie this year, and it was a good movie. It's not like the greatest cinematic thing. I enjoyed it. It's a solid movie. I think it does what it's supposed to do. It finds a way to communicate certain ideas well from the video games in ways that I think fit into storytelling. But I know the critiques, that's not what I'm getting at. If you ask me what my biggest challenge with this film, it's engaging with Mario speaking. Mario has always been a representative entity to me of joy and just the thrill of movement. It is weird to ask me now to ascribe feelings to Mario. And it was a barrier because I'm like, Mario doesn't have feelings. Mario is an avatar of the emotive joy of play. And it was a challenge. And I didn't have that challenge for anybody else in the movie because I think they've done a good job in terms of like making Luigi feel like a character that has certain feelings and emotions. Same thing with Peach in other games, in other ways of expression. But but Mario's just an avatar for the feeling of mechanical satisfaction. That's what he is, and that may be and so I had a challenging component when I'm watching the beginning of the film and him being sad. It's just like my brain can't process it. It wasn't even that it was bad storytelling. I know for some people it is, but that wasn't my challenge. It was like, but this is not a person. It was really difficult for me. And so when I say that to say there is something that we are not placing respect on as characters being avatars for an experience or a thing or an idea, that just applying voice does not make it immediately better. You can lose something in the storytelling mechanic or from the expression of playing a video game. I do not think if you throw Chrono Trigger in a Final Fantasy VII Remake perspective that you get Chrono Trigger again. That's because of how emotive certain things. I get it. People are like, but what about the Magus fight? Imagine the Magus fight in that. It would be cool. But I think about the humor of that game. And maybe I'll feel different when I play FF7 and Remake next to each other. But I think that there's just a conveyance through gesture, especially in sprites, that does so much more work that just a dialogue thing cannot do. And it does it for things that are not just traditional storytelling, but for experiences. So that's my thoughts. Tell me again what you think about Sidelined characters. Now, I'll wrap it up with something I think is important. As a JRPG fan to JRPG fan, I'll tell the truth here. Any good JRPG fan agrees that the greatest genre of music in video games, in terms of like which genre has the best music in the entire medium, it's JRPGs. And look, we're biased, but we have a point. I don't want to poo-poo on other genres, and I think especially when I think about Splinter Cell specifically, musically, it's just kind of incredible. So I'm being facetious now, but I say that to say, as a person who's trying to do a podcast about JRPGs, I feel like one of the most important things is talk about JRPG music. And so what I want to do in every episode is highlight 2 or 3 songs that have like really stood out to me. And I'm going to create a Spotify playlist that you'll have access to represent these, that are of just these songs. So you can just kind of like, oh yeah, these are some really good songs to keep into your JRPG bank of great music. That's an ever-growing thing. And if you really get into like the niche franchises, you know there's a lot of music. And obviously people has different tastes, so you might be like, well, those are what you like. So if you feel that way, you feel that way. But 3 songs I want to highlight. 2 of them from Final Fantasy V. To the North Mountain, X-Def's theme. Part of the reason why I like X-Def as a villain is that theme is banging. And every time he showed up in the story, it would be that theme. And then he would actually do something pretty engaging in the world and make an impact. I lost a whole Bard song that way where he ruined the Library of Ancients before I could go back and collect the song from there. And it's just like, so every time X-Def shows up on screen, they play, there's something with these dramatic strings. They're leaning on like the three on the third, it's a song on the fourth, three with the guitar, and then they switch to these pitch down strings, and then these descending synths. And it's really almost horror like. When they pull out the drums for like what would be equivalent, maybe not chorus, but you know what I mean. It's just this very dramatic, dark, rocking thing. It's truly wonderful. Another song that stood out from the Final Fantasy V soundtrack is To the North Mountain. I mentioned earlier that the funniest thing is that you do all this North Mountain build up to go fight a dragon, but you do this whole thing with the rope scene. But the part of the reason why I think it highlighted the contrasting tones is partly because of the music. The music is this, like, if you've ever listened to a Just Blaze song and how he samples horns, and you can tell the samples that he appreciates from sampling horns, he would sample the hell out of this in terms of how those trumpets kick in. It's this giant song. Like, it is so marching band, bombastic, and the bass line is so dang heavy. Again, if Just Blaze sampled this for a Dipset song in the mid-2000s, it would make sense because of the archetypes of songs that he would work with. It's this grand, blood pumping, I'ma go through the world feeling majestic as all hell. It's truly wonderful. And then lastly, the song that I was thinking about again recently is from Final Fantasy III, The Eternal Wind. And I was listening to a rendition today that had steel pans, and I'm like, is that really why I like this? And it made so much sense. There's like these steel pan effects, and I'm from Jamaica, so just there's a connection here. You get it. But beyond that, it's this tranquil strings. I mean, that's what Final Fantasy does all the time. If you told me that this would have been the replacement for the prelude, that's how good this could be. The Final Fantasy prelude is so iconic. So I'm not mentioning it here because we know this song. But when I was listening to Eternal Wind, I was like, if you're ever going to have to replace the prelude with something, I would replace it with this because of how like delicate and beautiful and soft these strings are. Again, wind to kind of evoke that very light feeling, but it's a in this very light steel panish component. It's just beautiful. And so when you think those, as I said, there will be an attachment to a Spotify playlist of just these three songs in case you've never heard them. So if there are JRPG music songs that you want me to highlight or bring forth in our future conversations, let me know. But on that note, that is the full episode today of Menu Combat. I hope you enjoyed it. This was nice to get back into the zone of making podcasts. And if there's anything that you wanted me to talk about, I have a list of like 20 topics that I have in mind that I'm just trying to keep track of. But if there's something you want me to like hone in on and discuss going forward, let me know. This has been a fun romp. Have a wonderful time. Get some good rest. Pause in the menu. Customize. And enjoy the rest of your day. Much love.